the headlights are off. The road is dark, a winding strip of Carolina blacktop that climbs through the hollows of Wilkes County like a snake coiling up the mountain. The car, a 1940 Ford Coupe, looks ordinary from the outside. Ordinary paint, ordinary bumpers, ordinary everything. But under the hood, the engine has been rebuilt, bored out, tuned until it produces nearly twice the horsepower the factory intended. The trunk is loaded with mason jars, 120 gallons of white corn liquor packed tight in burlap, bound for the honky-tonks and the back rooms of towns whose names do not appear on the maps that polite people use. And behind the wheel, gripping the steering hard, leaning into the curves with the absolute focus of a man for whom the difference between freedom and federal prison is measured in miles per hour, is a teenage boy from Ronda, North Carolina, named Robert Glenn Johnson Jr. The world would come to know him as Junior Johnson, the last American hero, according to the writer Tom Wolfe, who traveled to Wilkes County in the early 1960s and came back with a magazine article that transformed a moonshine runner-turned-stock car racer into one of the most mythologized figures in the history of American sport. The man who ran whiskey in the dark, the man who discovered drafting and used it to win at Daytona against cars that were 30 miles per hour faster than his own, the man who served 11 months in a federal prison for his involvement in his family's moonshine operation and who was later pardoned by the President of the United States. The man who won 50 Cup Series races as a driver, and then, after retiring from the cockpit, won 6 more championships as a team owner, guiding Cale Yarborough and Darrell Waltrip to a combined 6 titles that cemented his place as one of the most brilliant racing minds the sport has ever produced. 50 victories behind the wheel, 6 championships from the pit box, a presidential pardon, a Tom Wolfe essay, a founding member of the NASCAR Hall of Fame. The life of Junior Johnson does not fit into the categories that ordinary lives occupy. It spills over the edges, too large, too improbable, too thoroughly American in its combination of outlaw origins and legitimate greatness to be contained by any single narrative or any single label. He was a moonshiner, he was a convict, he was a champion, he was a genius. He was the man who understood the physics of drafting before the engineers had a name for it, who felt the pull of the slipstream in his bones and used it to rewrite the rules of superspeedway racing. He was the team owner who saw talent in Cale Yarborough when others saw only a wild man from South Carolina, who built the cars that carried 3 consecutive championships, who then turned around and did it again with Darrell Waltrip, the brash young driver from Kentucky, whose mouth moved almost as fast as his car. The story of Junior Johnson is the story of NASCAR itself compressed into a single life. The moonshine roots, the outlaw origins, the transformation from backroad running to sanctioned racing, the evolution from a driver who learned his craft, evading federal agents, to a team owner whose engineering innovations shaped the modern sport. Every chapter of the sport's history has a corresponding chapter in Junior Johnson's life, and the parallels are not coincidental, they are causal. Junior Johnson did not merely participate in the history of stock car racing, he made it, from the beginning. From the dirt roads of Wilkes County to the high banks of Daytona to the championship stages of the Cup Series, Junior Johnson was there, shaping the sport with his hands and his mind and his relentless, ungovernable will. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why Junior Johnson's life is the single most extraordinary life in the history of American motorsport. You are going to understand the moonshine culture that produced him, the prison sentence that interrupted him, the driving career that established him, the drafting innovation that revolutionized the sport, and the team ownership career that confirmed his genius. You are going to understand the man behind the myth, the farmer's son who became a legend, and the legacy he left behind when the engines finally fell silent. Before we get started, if you find these stories as moving as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate the legends of the game. Now, let us begin. There are those who will tell you that Junior Johnson was simply a product of his time, a man who happened to be in the right place at the right moment, a beneficiary of the circumstances that placed a talented moonshine runner at the birth of a sport that valued exactly the skills that moonshine running developed. The assessment is not entirely wrong. Johnson was a product of his time, shaped by the culture and the circumstances of Wilkes County in a way that made him uniquely suited for the sport that emerged from that culture. But the assessment is also profoundly incomplete because it fails to account for the agency, the genius, and the will that Johnson brought to the circumstances in which he found himself. Plenty of men ran moonshine in the Carolina mountains. Plenty of men had the driving skills and the mechanical knowledge that the trade required. But only one of them became Junior Johnson. Only one of them discovered drafting. Only one of them won 50 cup races. Only one of them built a team that won 6 championships. Only one of them received a presidential pardon. The circumstances provided the raw material. Johnson provided the transformation. And the distance between the raw material and the transformation is the distance between an ordinary life and a legendary one. The moonshine roads of Wilkes County produced many skilled drivers. The sport of NASCAR produced many champions. But the combination of the moonshine roads and the championship stages, connected by a single life that was lived with an intensity and a purpose that exceeded the reach of either origin alone, produced something that the sport has never seen before and will never see again. It produced Junior Johnson. The 230 races that Johnson's cars won, 50 as a driver and 180 more as a team owner, represent a combined body of work that is staggering in its scope. The 6 championships that his teams produced as an owner, added to the 50 victories he won behind the wheel, create a competitive legacy that spans both sides of the pit wall. And that demonstrates a mastery of the sport that is more comprehensive than any other individual has achieved. The driver who won at Daytona through the discovery of drafting was the same man who built the cars that carried Cal Yarborough to 3 consecutive championships and Darrell Waltrip to 3 more. The continuity of excellence, maintained across the transition from cockpit to pit box, is without parallel in the sport's history. The presidential pardon that Johnson received from Ronald Reagan in 1986 was more than a legal formality. It was a cultural statement, a recognition by the highest office in the land that the man who had been convicted of a federal crime in his youth had redeemed himself through a career of extraordinary achievement and had earned the right to have the stain of that conviction officially removed. The pardon was controversial, as presidential pardons often are, but it was also widely celebrated within the racing community and beyond as a just conclusion to a story that had moved from outlaw origins through legitimate greatness to formal recognition. The Tom Wolfe profile that appeared in Esquire magazine in 1965, titled "The Last American Hero is Junior Johnson," was more than a magazine article. It was a cultural event that transformed the way America understood both the man and the sport he represented. Wolfe, whose immersive, stylistically innovative journalism was redefining the possibilities of non-fiction writing, traveled to Wilkes County and embedded himself in the culture that had produced Johnson, living among the moonshiners and the racers and the dirt road philosophers of the Carolina mountain country. The article that emerged from this immersion was a masterpiece of narrative journalism, a portrait of a man and a community that captured the defiance, the courage, and the distinctly American character of the moonshine to racing pipeline with a vividness that no previous piece of sports writing had matched. The article placed Johnson in the context of a broader American narrative, the story of the outlaw hero, the man who operates outside the boundaries of respectable society, but who possesses qualities of skill, courage, and independence that the respectable society secretly envies. The framing was brilliant, connecting Johnson's story to the deep currents of American mythology, to the frontier heroes and the rebels, and the self-made men who populate the national imagination. The article made Johnson famous beyond the racing world, introducing him to readers who had never watched a stock car race, and who might never watch one, but who recognized in Johnson's story something that resonated with their own understanding of what it means to be American. The impact of the Wolfe article on Johnson's public persona and on the sport's cultural identity was permanent. The article established the moonshine origin myth as the foundational narrative of NASCAR, the story that the sport would tell about itself for the next 6 decades. The narrative was not false. The moonshine connection was real, and the skills and the culture that the moonshine trade had produced were genuinely the skills and the culture that stock car racing was built on. But the narrative was also selective, emphasizing the romantic elements of the story, while downplaying the poverty, the legal consequences, and the human costs that the moonshine trade also produced. The selectivity was understandable. Romance makes better copy than misery. But the full story of Junior Johnson and the culture that produced him includes both the romance and the reality, and any honest assessment of his legacy must account for both. To understand the world that produced Junior Johnson, you have to understand the death that surrounded it. Stock car racing in the 1950s and 1960s was not a sport in the way that modern audiences understand sport. It was a contest conducted in the immediate presence of mortality, a pursuit in which the possibility of death was not an abstraction, but a constant, a palpable companion that rode in the cockpit beside every driver who took the green flag. The men who raced during this era did not have the luxury of assuming they would survive. They raced with the understanding that any lap could be the last, that the machines they piloted were inadequate to protect them, that the tracks they competed on were indifferent to their survival, and that the sport they loved was fully capable of killing them. The roll call of the dead from the early decades of NASCAR is long, sobering, and necessary. The names represent the human cost of a sport that was, during its formative years, extraordinarily dangerous and extraordinarily reluctant to confront the implications of that danger. The safety equipment was minimal. The helmets were open-face designs that offered limited protection against impact. The driving suits were cotton, not the fire-resistant materials that modern drivers wear. The roll cages were rudimentary, designed to prevent the most catastrophic structural failures, but offering little protection against the lateral impacts and the intrusion events that were the most common causes of fatal injury. The fuel systems were not designed to contain the fuel in the event of a crash, and the fires that resulted from ruptured fuel lines and shattered fuel tanks were among the most terrifying and most deadly hazards of the sport. Fireball Roberts, one of the most talented and most charismatic drivers of the early era, was one of the most prominent casualties. Roberts died in July of 1964 from injuries sustained in a fiery crash at Charlotte Motor Speedway during the World 600 in May. The crash occurred when Roberts' car was struck by another vehicle, rupturing the fuel tank and engulfing the car in flames. Roberts survived the initial crash, but suffered burns over more than 80% of his body. He lingered for 6 weeks before succumbing to his injuries. His death, a prolonged and devastating illustration of the consequences that inadequate safety equipment could produce. Joe Weatherly, the 2-time Cup Series champion, died in January of 1964 at Riverside International Raceway in California when his car struck a retaining wall and his head, unprotected by the rudimentary roll cage of the era, made contact with the wall. The impact was fatal. Weatherly was 32 years old, in the prime of his career, and his death was a shock that reverberated through the racing community. Billy Wade, a promising young driver who had won 4 consecutive Cup races in 1964, was killed in a tire test at Daytona International Speedway in January of 1965. The crash occurred during a private test session, away from the attention of the public and the media, and the death was a reminder that the danger of the sport was not confined to the competitive events that drew the crowds and the cameras. These deaths, and the dozens of others that occurred during the decades in which Junior Johnson competed, created a culture of fatalism that permeated the racing community. The drivers who competed during this era did not discuss death with the openness that modern athletes bring to conversations about risk and safety. They acknowledged it privately, in the quiet moments between races, in the late-night conversations at the hotels and the diners where the racing community gathered, but they did not allow the acknowledgement to interfere with the competition. The races continued. The schedules were maintained. The flags dropped and the engines fired, and the cars circled the tracks at speeds that the safety equipment of the era was not designed to accommodate. Junior Johnson competed through the worst of this era, racing at a time when the death of a fellow competitor was not an exceptional event, but a recurring feature of the competitive landscape. He raced at tracks where the guardrails were inadequate, where the medical facilities were primitive, and where the response time between a crash and the arrival of competent medical care could be measured in minutes rather than seconds. He raced in cars that offered minimal protection, wearing equipment that was insufficient for the forces that high-speed crashes generated, and he raced with the knowledge, shared by every driver of his era, that the survival of each race was not guaranteed. The physical courage required to compete under these conditions was extraordinary. It was not the courage of ignorance, the bravery of a man who does not understand the risks he is taking. It was the courage of full awareness, the bravery of a man who understood exactly what the sport could do to him, and who chose to compete anyway, because the alternative, a life without racing, was a life that was not worth the safety it offered. The safety improvements that eventually transformed the sport came gradually, driven not by proactive planning, but by the accumulation of tragedies that demonstrated the inadequacy of the existing protections. Each death produced a period of mourning and reflection, but the reflection rarely produced immediate action. The improvements came in increments: a better helmet here, a modified roll cage there, a new fuel cell design that reduced the risk of fire in the event of a crash. The incremental approach was frustrating to the safety advocates, who argued for more comprehensive reforms, but it was the reality of a sport that was governed by a conservative culture that valued tradition and that was resistant to changes that might alter the character of the competition. The fuel cell development was one of the most significant safety innovations of the era. The replacement of the standard fuel tanks with rubber fuel cells that were designed to contain the fuel in the event of a crash dramatically reduced the risk of fire, which had been one of the most terrifying and most deadly hazards of the sport. The fuel cell innovation was a direct response to the deaths caused by fires, including the death of Fireball Roberts, and its implementation was one of the first concrete steps toward the systematic approach to safety that would eventually transform the sport. The roll cage evolution was another critical development. The early roll cages were simple structures that provided basic protection against roof collapse in the event of a rollover, but that offered limited protection against the lateral impacts and the intrusion events that were the most common causes of serious injury. Over the course of the 1960s and 1970s, the roll cage designs were progressively strengthened, with additional bars and reinforcements added to protect the driver from impacts in multiple directions. The evolution was driven by the engineering analysis of crash events and by the recognition that the forces generated in high-speed crashes required more comprehensive structural protection than the early designs provided. The helmet technology evolved as well, with the transition from open-face to full-face designs providing significantly better protection for the driver's face and jaw. The full-face helmets were initially resisted by some drivers who found them uncomfortable and who preferred the visibility and the ventilation that the open-face designs provided, but the evidence of the improved protection was overwhelming, and the full-face designs eventually became the standard. The fire-resistant driving suits that replaced the cotton uniforms of the earlier era were another critical safety development. The suits, made from materials that could withstand high temperatures without igniting, provided the driver with a critical margin of protection in the event of a fire, buying time for the rescue crews to reach the car and to extract the driver. The transition from cotton to fire-resistant materials was a simple change that had profound implications for driver survival, and its implementation was one of the most important safety developments of the era. The medical response capabilities at the tracks improved gradually during the years of Johnson's career. With the addition of better equipped medical facilities, more highly trained medical personnel, and faster response times between the crash and the arrival of medical care, the improvements were significant but uneven, with some tracks investing more heavily in medical infrastructure than others. and with the quality of the medical response varying from event to event. Johnson witnessed all of this. He competed through the era when the safety was at its worst, when the deaths were most frequent, and when the culture of the sport was most resistant to the changes that might have prevented some of those deaths. He lost friends, he attended funerals, he carried the knowledge that the sport he loved was capable of taking everything, and he competed anyway, with a courage and a determination that were characteristic of the generation of drivers who built the sport during its most dangerous years. The dark history of racing fatalities is not a subject that the sport dwells on. The preference is for the stories of triumph, for the victories and the championships and the celebrations that make the sport feel heroic and life-affirming. And there is value in those stories. But the full history of the sport includes the deaths, the suffering, and the slow, painful process of learning, through tragedy after tragedy, that the pursuit of speed must be accompanied by a commitment to the safety of the people who pursue it. Junior Johnson's career spanned the worst of the danger and the beginning of the improvement. He competed when the risk was highest, when the protections were fewest, and when the courage required to climb into a race car was the greatest. The fact that he survived, that he competed for more than a decade, without suffering the kind of catastrophic injury that claimed so many of his contemporaries, was a combination of skill, luck, and the physical toughness that his Wilkes County upbringing had instilled in him. The survival was not guaranteed. It was earned race by race, lap by lap, through the application of the driving talent and the competitive intelligence that made Junior Johnson one of the most formidable competitors the sport has ever known. The era shaped the man. The constant presence of death gave Johnson's racing a weight and a seriousness that went beyond the competitive dynamics of any individual event. He was not racing for trophies or for money or for the admiration of the crowds. He was racing because racing was who he was, because the act of driving a car at the limits of its capabilities on a track that was indifferent to his survival was the purest expression of the identity that the dirt roads of Wilkes County had forged in him. The danger was part of it, the risk was part of it, and the willingness to accept both, to embrace the full cost of the racing life without complaint or hesitation, was the quality that set Johnson apart from the men who were fast but who lacked the fundamental courage that the era demanded. The legacy of the safety evolution that occurred during and after Johnson's career is one of the most important and most underappreciated dimensions of the sport's history. The improvements that were made, the fuel cells and the roll cages and the fire-resistant suits and the improved medical response capabilities saved lives. They prevented injuries. They allowed drivers to walk away from crashes that would have been fatal in the earlier era. The improvements are a tribute to the men who died, a recognition that their deaths were not in vain, that the lessons of their sacrifices were eventually learned and eventually applied. But the improvements are also a reminder of the cost, the terrible, accumulating cost of the education, the lives that were lost in the process of learning what should have been known from the beginning, that the pursuit of speed must be accompanied by the protection of the people who pursue it. Junior Johnson understood this. He understood it not as an abstraction, but as a lived reality, a truth that was written in the faces of the friends he had lost, and in the scars of the crashes he had survived. The understanding did not diminish his competitive fire, it intensified it, giving his racing a purpose and a meaning that transcended the individual results, and that connected him to the larger story of a sport that was learning, slowly and painfully, how to honor both the courage and the lives of the men who built it. The specific tracks that hosted Cup Series events during Johnson's era were, in many cases, venues that would be considered dangerously inadequate by modern standards. The guardrails were often steel beams that did not absorb impact energy, but instead redirected it back into the car and the driver. The walls were concrete or steel, unyielding surfaces that transmitted the full force of a crash into the cockpit. The runoff areas were minimal, with some tracks placing the walls within feet of the racing surface, leaving no margin for error and no buffer between a minor mistake and a catastrophic crash. Darlington Raceway, the first large paved track in the sport, and one of the tracks where Johnson competed throughout his career, was a particularly dangerous venue during the early years. The track's asymmetric layout, with one end tighter than the other, created a driving challenge that demanded constant adjustment. The walls were close, especially on the narrow backstretch, and the Darlington stripe, the mark that a car acquired when it scraped against the outside wall, was a near-universal badge among the drivers who competed there. The stripe was evidence of the proximity of danger, a physical reminder that the margin between a clean lap and a wall hit was measured in inches. The dirt tracks that populated the Cup schedule during the early years of Johnson's career presented their own set of safety challenges. The surfaces were unpredictable, changing from lap to lap as the cars compacted the clay and redistributed the loose material. The dust that the racing generated reduced visibility, sometimes dramatically, creating conditions in which drivers were effectively racing blind, navigating by memory and by the faint outlines of the cars ahead rather than by clear sight lines. The crashes on dirt were often violent, with the cars rolling and tumbling in ways that the rudimentary roll cages of the era were not designed to withstand. Charlotte Motor Speedway, which opened in 1960 and which quickly became one of the marquee venues on the Cup schedule, was the site of several significant crashes during Johnson's era. The track's mile-and-a-half layout and its moderate banking produced high speeds that tested the limits of the tyres, the brakes, and the structural integrity of the cars. The crashes at Charlotte were among the most severe on the circuit, reflecting the combination of high speeds and the limited safety infrastructure that characterized the track during its early years. Daytona International Speedway, the cathedral of the sport, and the track where Johnson produced the most famous victory of his career, was simultaneously the most spectacular and the most dangerous venue on the circuit. The high-banked turns, rising 31 degrees above the flat Florida terrain, allowed cars to carry speeds that exceeded anything possible on a flat track, producing a spectacle that was thrilling for the spectators and terrifying for the drivers. The crashes at Daytona, when they occurred, were among the most violent in the sport because the higher speeds translated directly into greater impact forces. Johnson's willingness to compete at Daytona, to push his car to the limits of its capabilities on a track that was actively trying to kill him, was a manifestation of the physical courage that defined his generation. The discovery of drafting added another dimension of danger to the superspeedway racing because the close formation running that drafting required placed the drivers in positions where a single mistake by any car in the formation could trigger a multi-car accident of devastating proportions. The drafting that Johnson discovered was both a competitive innovation and a safety risk, a technique that made the racing more exciting and more dangerous simultaneously. The culture of the racing community during Johnson's era was shaped by the constant presence of death in ways that modern fans would find difficult to comprehend. The funerals were attended by the same men who had been racing the previous weekend and who would be racing the following weekend. The grief was processed quickly, not because the drivers did not feel it, but because the schedule did not accommodate extended mourning. The races continued, the competition continued, and the men who competed carried with them the knowledge that any race could be the last, that the car they were climbing into might be the instrument of their death, and that the courage to accept this possibility was the most fundamental requirement of their profession. The emotional toll of competing under these conditions was significant and was borne primarily in silence. The drivers of Johnson's era did not discuss their fears or their grief in public. The culture of toughness that the sport valued did not accommodate the expression of vulnerability, and the men who competed were expected to process their emotions privately and to present a stoic, untroubled exterior to the world. The emotional suppression was a coping mechanism, a way of managing the psychological burden of competing in a sport that could kill you, but it was also a burden of its own, creating a reservoir of unexpressed grief and fear that accumulated over the years, and that affected the men who carried it in ways that were not always visible. Johnson navigated the emotional dimensions of the era with the same toughness and the same directness that he brought to every other challenge. He did not discuss his fears. He did not dwell on the deaths of his competitors. He acknowledged them, mourned them privately, and returned to the track with the determination and the focus that the competition demanded. The emotional resilience was genuine, a product of the Wilkes County upbringing that had prepared him for a life of hardship and that had instilled in him the conviction that a man's value was measured by his ability to endure and to persist, regardless of the obstacles that the world placed in his path. The broader historical context of the safety evolution that occurred during and after Johnson's career is one of the most important narratives in the sport's history. The transformation from one of the most dangerous sports in the world to a sport in which fatal outcomes are rare is a testament to the engineers, the officials, and the advocates who pushed for improvements, often against the resistance of a conservative culture that was reluctant to accept change. The transformation did not occur overnight. It occurred over decades, driven by the accumulation of tragedies and by the recognition, however gradual, that the sport's long-term viability depended on its ability to protect the people who participated in it. The HANS device, mandated in the wake of Dale Earnhardt's death in 2001, was one of the most significant safety innovations in the sport's history, preventing the basilar skull fractures that had been a leading cause of death in stock car racing crashes. The safer barriers, energy-absorbing walls that replaced the rigid concrete and steel barriers at many tracks, reduced the severity of wall impacts and contributed to a dramatic reduction in the frequency of serious injuries. The Car of Tomorrow, introduced in 2007, incorporated a range of safety features that were designed to protect the driver in the event of a crash, including a larger cockpit, enhanced roll cage construction, and an energy-absorbing structure that was designed to manage the forces of an impact. These innovations came after Johnson's career, but they were the culmination of a safety evolution that had been underway since the era in which he competed. The deaths that occurred during Johnson's years on the track contributed to the awareness that drove the safety improvements, and the drivers who died, the Fireball Robertses and the Joe Weatherlys and the Billy Wades, and the dozens of others whose names are recorded in the sport's tragic roll call, were the unwilling teachers whose sacrifices provided the lessons that eventually made the sport safer for the generations that followed. Johnson understood this connection between sacrifice and progress. He understood that the men who died during his era had paid a price that contributed, however indirectly, to the safety of the men who would compete in the decades after them. The understanding did not diminish his grief at their loss. It gave it a meaning, a context, a place in a larger narrative that connected the deaths of the past to the safety of the future, and that recognized that progress, in the world of racing as in the world beyond it, is sometimes purchased at a cost that no one would willingly pay. The track evolution that accompanied the safety evolution during the decades following Johnson's career transformed the competitive landscape in ways that the drivers of his era could not have imagined. The addition of safer barriers at the major tracks reduced the severity of wall impacts. The repaving of track surfaces improved the grip levels and reduced the unpredictability that worn, deteriorated surfaces produced. The expansion of runoff areas provided the margin for error that the tight, wall-lined tracks of the earlier era had not offered. The improvements were welcome and necessary, but they also changed the character of the racing, reducing the danger and the rawness that had been defining features of the sport during the years when Johnson competed. The legacy of the era that produced Junior Johnson is a legacy of courage, sacrifice, and the slow, painful acquisition of the knowledge that the pursuit of speed must be accompanied by the protection of the people who pursue it. The men who competed during the most dangerous years of the sport built the foundation on which the modern, safer version of the sport was constructed, and their contribution, measured in blood and in grief as well as in victories and championships, is the most fundamental contribution in the sport's history. Junior Johnson was one of these men. His survival was not guaranteed, his courage was not optional, and his willingness to compete, race after race, year after year, in machines that could kill him on tracks that were indifferent to his survival, was the quality that defined him as a man and as a competitor, and that earned him the respect and the reverence of every person who understands what it cost to build the sport that millions now enjoy. The introduction of the restrictor plate at Daytona and Talladega in 1988, which occurred after Johnson's driving career, but during his ownership career, was itself a response to a safety crisis. Bobby Allison's terrifying incident at Talladega in 1987, when his car went airborne and nearly penetrated the catch fence separating the track from the grandstands, demonstrated that the speeds the cars were reaching exceeded the capacity of the safety infrastructure to contain them. The restrictor plate, which limited the engine's air intake and thereby reduced its power output, was mandated as a way of bringing the speeds down to a level that the tyres, the cars, and the track facilities could safely manage. The restrictor plate was a blunt instrument, a crude but effective way of reducing speed that also changed the competitive character of the superspeedway races. The plates equalized the performance of the cars, producing the tight, pack racing conditions that would become the signature of modern Daytona and Talladega events. The pack racing was spectacular, but also dangerous in its own way, because the close formation running created conditions in which a single incident could trigger a chain reaction involving dozens of cars. The trade-off between speed reduction and pack racing danger was one of the ongoing tensions in the sport's safety management. Johnson's teams competed under the restrictor plate rules during the later years of his ownership career, adapting to the changed competitive dynamics with the same ingenuity that had characterized the team's approach to every other technical challenge. The restrictor plate races required a different set of preparation strategies and a different set of driving skills than the unrestricted races, and the team's ability to adapt to these requirements was a reflection of the organizational flexibility that Johnson had built into the operation. The driver safety equipment evolution that occurred during the span of Johnson's involvement in the sport was dramatic. When Johnson began racing in the 1950s, the safety equipment consisted of a basic helmet, cotton clothing, and whatever structural protection the car's body panels could provide. By the time he retired from team ownership in the 1990s, the safety equipment had evolved to include full-face helmets, fire-resistant driving suits, 5-point restraint harnesses, fuel cells designed to prevent post-crash fires, and roll cage constructions that provided substantial protection against the forces of impact. The evolution was the product of decades of incremental improvement, each step forward driven by the recognition that the existing equipment was inadequate and by the engineering knowledge needed to design and manufacture better alternatives. The process was slow, sometimes frustratingly so, and the deaths and injuries that occurred during the periods between improvements were a constant reminder that the pace of the evolution was not fast enough to prevent all of the consequences that the sport's inherent danger could produce. The legacy of the safety evolution extends beyond the specific equipment improvements to encompass a fundamental shift in the sport's attitude toward the responsibility it bears for the well-being of its participants. The early era, the era in which Johnson began his career, was characterized by a fatalistic acceptance of danger that viewed deaths and injuries as the inevitable cost of competition. The modern era is characterized by a proactive approach to safety that views every death and every serious injury as a failure to be investigated, understood, and prevented from recurring. The shift in attitude from fatalistic acceptance to proactive prevention is one of the most important cultural changes in the sport's history, and it was driven in significant part by the accumulation of tragedies that demonstrated the inadequacy of the fatalistic approach. Johnson's career spanned both attitudes, from the fatalistic acceptance of the early era to the beginnings of the proactive approach that would eventually transform the sport. His contribution to the safety dimension of the sport was primarily indirect, expressed through his survival and his success rather than through advocacy or activism. Johnson was not a safety crusader. He was a competitor who accepted the risks of his profession and who competed with a courage that was characteristic of his era. But his survival through the most dangerous years of the sport and his success in building a team that competed safely and successfully for decades contributed to the broader narrative of the sport's evolution from a dangerous, unregulated enterprise to a safer, more responsibly managed one. The cultural dimension of the safety conversation during Johnson's era was shaped by the values of the communities from which the sport drew its participants and its audiences. The Southern, working-class culture that was the foundation of stock car racing valued toughness, self-reliance, and the ability to endure hardship without complaint. These values, while admirable in many contexts, created a resistance to safety improvements that were perceived as softening the sport or as undermining the courage that the competition demanded. The drivers who advocated for better safety equipment were sometimes viewed with suspicion by a culture that equated the acceptance of risk with the demonstration of masculine virtue, and the advocacy for safety was sometimes framed, unfairly, as a sign of weakness or cowardice. The resistance was gradually overcome, driven by the accumulation of tragedies that made the case for improvement impossible to ignore. Each death, each career-ending injury, added to the body of evidence that the existing protections were inadequate, and that the resistance to change was producing consequences that no reasonable person could defend. The evolution was slow, far slower than it should have been, but it was real, and the sport that exists today, with its comprehensive safety protocols and its dramatically reduced fatality rate, is the product of decades of painful incremental learning that occurred during and after the era in which Junior Johnson competed. The contrast between the safety culture of Johnson's era and the safety culture of the modern sport illuminates the magnitude of the transformation that has occurred. The modern Cup Series driver is protected by a comprehensive system of safety measures that encompasses the car's structure, the track's barriers, the driver's personal equipment, and the medical response capabilities that are available in the event of an accident. The system is not perfect. No system can eliminate all risk from an activity that involves speeds exceeding 190 miles per hour, but the system is incomparably better than what existed during Johnson's era, and the improvement is a tribute to the engineers, the officials, and the advocates who pushed for change, often against the resistance of a culture that was slow to acknowledge the necessity of that change. Johnson's generation of drivers was the generation that bore the greatest cost of the inadequate safety standards of the early era. They competed when the danger was highest, when the protections were fewest, and when the willingness to accept fatal risk was considered a prerequisite for participation. They built the sport through their talents and their courage, and they paid for that building, in some cases, with their lives. The debt that the modern sport owes to these men is a debt that can never be fully repaid, but it can be acknowledged, honoured, and remembered, and the acknowledgement, the honouring, and the remembering are obligations that the sport must continue to meet. Robert Glenn Johnson Jr. was born on June 28, 1931, in Ronda, North Carolina, a tiny community in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Wilkes County, the moonshine capital of the world. The designation was not honorary, it was earned. Wilkes County, with its remote hollows and its abundant corn and its mountain streams, that provided the pure water essential to quality whiskey production, was the epicenter of the illegal liquor trade in the American South. A place where the production and the distribution of untaxed corn whiskey was not merely an illegal enterprise, but a way of life, an economic foundation, and a cultural identity that had been passed from generation to generation for as long as anyone could remember. The Johnson family was deep in the trade. Junior's father, Robert Glenn Johnson Sr., was a moonshiner whose operation in the Wilkes County Hollows produced corn whiskey that was distributed across the region. The operation was not a sideline or a hobby. It was the family business, the source of income that sustained the Johnsons, and that provided the young Junior with his first exposure to the skills that would eventually carry him to racing glory. The skills of the moonshiner and the skills of the race car driver were, in the Wilkes County context, essentially the same skills. Both required the ability to drive fast on difficult roads. Both required mechanical knowledge, the ability to build and maintain an engine that could outperform the standard factory equipment. Both required courage, the willingness to operate at the edge of control, and to accept the consequences if the edge was exceeded. Junior began running moonshine as a teenager, driving the modified Ford coupes that the Wilkes County runners used to transport their product from the stills in the hollows to the distribution points in the towns and cities of the Piedmont and the coastal plain. The runs were conducted at night, on roads that were unpaved, unlit, and treacherous, at speeds that the roads were never designed to accommodate. The revenue agents, the federal officers whose job was to intercept the runners and to shut down the stills, were a constant threat, and the ability to outrun them, to use superior speed and superior driving skill to evade pursuit, was the moonshiner's most essential capability. Junior was, by all accounts, one of the best runners in the county. His driving was aggressive, instinctive, and fearless, characteristics that reflected both his natural talent and the urgency of the enterprise. A runner who was caught lost his car, his cargo, and his freedom. The stakes were high enough to produce driving performances that were, within the closed world of the moonshine culture, legendary. The stories of Junior's runs, of the speeds he achieved on roads that would have been dangerous at half the pace, of the pursuit evasions that demonstrated a car control and a tactical intelligence that the revenue agents could not match, became part of the folklore of Wilkes County, stories that were told and retold and embellished, with each telling until the line between fact and legend was impossible to draw. The transition from moonshine running to competitive racing was natural and almost inevitable. The men who ran moonshine in the Carolina Hills were, by the necessities of their trade, among the most skilled drivers in the world, and the desire to test those skills against each other in a competitive setting was as old as the trade itself. The informal races that the runners organized on weekends, held in cow pastures and on abandoned airstrips, were the direct precursors of the organized stock car racing that Bill France Sr. would formalize with the creation of NASCAR in 1948. Junior's entry into competitive racing came in the early 1950s, and the results were immediate and impressive. He was fast, he was aggressive, he was possessed of a natural talent for the machinery and the dynamics of stock car racing that set him apart from the other competitors in the field. The dirt tracks of the Carolina Piedmont, the small ovals that served as the developmental grounds for the sport's next generation of champions, were the stages on which Johnson's talent was first displayed to a wider audience, and the performances he produced on those stages left no doubt that the moonshiner from Ronda was destined for the national circuit. The Cup Series career that followed was abbreviated by the standards of some of his contemporaries, but was extraordinary in its intensity and its impact. Johnson competed in the Cup Series from 1953 through 1966, a span of 14 seasons that produced 50 victories, 47 pole positions, and a reputation for driving ability and competitive ferocity that was unmatched in the sport. The 50 victories were accumulated in only 313 career starts, a winning percentage of nearly 16% that places Johnson among the most efficient competitors in the sport's history. The victories came on every type of track the schedule offered. Johnson won on the dirt tracks that were still part of the Cup schedule during the early years of his career, demonstrating the skills that his moonshine running background had developed. He won on the paved short tracks that were replacing the dirt ovals as the sport evolved. He won on the superspeedways that were reshaping the competitive landscape, and he won at Daytona International Speedway, the cathedral of the sport, in the race that would become the most famous victory of his career, and one of the most significant moments in the history of stock car racing. The 1960 Daytona 500 qualifying race was the event that introduced Junior Johnson to the broader American public, and that demonstrated, in the most dramatic way possible, the innovation that would revolutionize superspeedway racing. Johnson's car, a 1959 Chevrolet, was significantly slower than the factory-backed Pontiacs that dominated the speed charts during practice and qualifying. The horsepower deficit was substantial, and by any conventional analysis, Johnson should not have been competitive in a race against cars that were 30 miles per hour faster on the straightaways. But Johnson had discovered something. During practice, running behind the faster Pontiacs, he noticed that his car was able to maintain speed in the slipstream of the car ahead, without using as much horsepower as he needed when running alone. The phenomenon, which would later be explained by the principles of aerodynamics and which would become known as drafting, was not fully understood by anyone at the time. Johnson did not have the vocabulary of the aerodynamicist or the equations of the physicist. He had something better. He had the feel. He could sense, through the behavior of his car and through the subtle changes in speed and handling that occurred when he positioned himself behind a faster car, that the air was doing something for him, was helping him, was reducing the resistance that his car faced and allowing it to travel faster than it could on its own. And it gets harder to overstate how revolutionary this discovery was. Drafting was not merely a new technique. It was a new understanding of the physics of high-speed racing, an insight that would fundamentally alter the way superspeedway races were contested for the next 6 decades and beyond. Before Johnson's discovery, superspeedway racing was primarily a contest of horsepower. The fastest car, absent mechanical failure, would win. After Johnson's discovery, superspeedway racing became a contest of strategy as well as speed, a chess match in which the driver's ability to use the draft, to position himself within the aerodynamic wake of the cars around him, became as important as the power under his hood. Johnson used the draft to win at Daytona, defeating the faster Pontiacs through a combination of tactical brilliance and the physical courage required to run inches behind another car at speeds approaching 150 miles per hour. The victory was a sensation, a demonstration that a smaller, less powerful car, in the hands of a driver with the skill and the intelligence to exploit an aerodynamic principle that no one else fully understood, could defeat the factory-backed machines that dominated the speed charts. The prison sentence that interrupted Johnson's racing career was one of the most significant and most painful episodes of his life. In 1956, Johnson was arrested at his father's moonshine still in Wilkes County and was subsequently convicted of federal charges related to the production of untaxed whiskey. He was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison and served approximately 11 months before being released. The sentence was the consequence of a life that had been lived on both sides of the law, the price that the legal system extracted for the moonshine running that had been the economic foundation of his family and the training ground for his driving career. The prison time was a crucible. Johnson has spoken about the experience with the directness that characterized all of his public statements, acknowledging the mistake, accepting the consequence, and describing the determination that the experience instilled in him to build a legitimate life that did not depend on the illegal enterprise that had brought him to the attention of the federal authorities. The prison time did not break Johnson. It hardened him, adding to the toughness and the self-reliance that the Wilkes County upbringing had already provided, and giving him a motivation to succeed in the legitimate world that was fueled by the desire to leave the outlaw world behind. The return to racing after the prison sentence was a homecoming in the deepest sense. Johnson returned to the track with a determination that was intensified by the experience of incarceration, and his post-prison performances were among the most impressive of his career. The 50 career victories included many that were won after the prison sentence, demonstrating that the time away from the track had not diminished his talent or his competitive fire. The retirement from driving in 1966, at the age of 35, was driven not by a decline in ability, but by a recognition that the economic opportunities available to a team owner exceeded those available to a driver, and that the skills Johnson had developed, the mechanical knowledge, the strategic intelligence, the understanding of what a race car needed to go fast, could be more effectively applied from the pit box than from the cockpit. But here is what makes this story unforgettable. The transition from driver to owner was not a step down, it was an elevation. Junior Johnson, the driver, had won 50 races and had been one of the most feared competitors of his era. Junior Johnson, the owner, would win 140 races and 6 championships, producing a body of work that exceeded his driving career in both duration and impact. The man who had learned to go fast on the moonshine roads of Wilkes County would become one of the most successful team owners in the history of the sport, building an operation that dominated the Cup Series for more than a decade and that produced champions whose names are woven into the fabric of the sport's history. The Cale-Yarborough partnership, which produced 3 consecutive championships from 1976 through 1978, was the first great chapter of Johnson's ownership career. Johnson saw in Yarborough a kindred spirit, a man whose physical courage and competitive intensity matched his own, and the partnership between the two men produced a period of dominance that has been equalled only once in the sport's history. The cars that Johnson built for Yarborough were fast, innovative, and occasionally controversial in their interpretation of the rules, reflecting Johnson's conviction that the space between what the rules explicitly permitted and what they explicitly prohibited was a space in which competitive advantage could be found. The Darrell-Waltrip partnership, which followed the Yarborough years, produced 3 more championships in 1981, 1982 and 1985. Waltrip was a different kind of driver than Yarborough, more verbal, more flamboyant, more willing to engage in the public gamesmanship that Yarborough's stoic personality eschewed. But the talent was genuine, and Johnson's ability to prepare cars that suited Waltrip's driving style, combined with the strategic acumen that Johnson brought to the management of the championship campaigns, produced a second dynasty that cemented Johnson's reputation as one of the most brilliant team owners in the sport's history. 6 championships as an owner, 140 victories, a legacy that encompassed both the driving career and the ownership career, and that demonstrated, in the most comprehensive way possible, that Junior Johnson's genius was not limited to any single role or any single dimension of the racing enterprise. He could drive, he could build, he could strategize, he could identify talent, he could manage personalities, he could push the boundaries of the rules, and he could win with a frequency and a consistency that placed him among the most successful figures in the history of the sport. The presidential pardon that Johnson received from Ronald Reagan in 1986 was the formal resolution of the legal legacy of the moonshine conviction that had sent him to prison 3 decades earlier. The pardon restored Johnson's full civil rights and removed the federal conviction from his record, providing a legal closure that matched the professional and personal rehabilitation that Johnson had achieved through his racing career. The pardon was controversial in some quarters, but was celebrated within the racing community as a recognition that the man who had served his time and who had gone on to build one of the most successful careers in the sport's history deserved to have the legal stain of his youthful transgression officially erased. The Tom Wolfe article, published in Esquire magazine in 1965 under the title "The Last American Hero is Junior Johnson," yes, was the cultural event that transformed Johnson from a racing figure into a national figure. Wolfe, one of the founders of the new journalism movement, traveled to Wilkes County and immersed himself in the culture of moonshine and stock car racing, producing an article that captured the romance, the danger, and the distinctly American character of Johnson's story with a vividness and a literary quality that the racing media of the era could not match. The article introduced Johnson to an audience that extended far beyond the racing community, establishing him as a cultural icon whose story resonated with the broader American fascination with outlaws, underdogs, and men who made their own rules. The truth gets heavier when you consider the full scope of what Junior Johnson accomplished and the full context of the era in which he accomplished it. He began as a moonshiner, running whiskey on dark roads in the North Carolina mountains. He went to prison for it. He came back and won 50 Cup Series races in an era when the danger was at its most extreme. He retired from driving and built a team that won 6 championships. He received a presidential pardon. He was inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame as a member of the inaugural class. And through all of it, from the moonshine stills of Wilkes County to the championship stages of the Cup Series, he remained the same man, the farmer's son from Ronda, the man whose genius was forged in the hollows of the Blue Ridge Mountains and whose legacy would stretch across the entire history of the sport. The mechanical aptitude that Johnson demonstrated from his earliest years was not learned in a classroom or a vocational program. It was learned in the field, in the garages and the workshops of Wilkes County, where the practical demands of rural life required every able-bodied person to possess a working knowledge of machinery and its maintenance. The Johnson family's moonshine operation day required not just the agricultural knowledge to grow the corn and the distilling knowledge to produce the whiskey, but the mechanical knowledge to maintain the vehicles that transported the product and to modify those vehicles to outperform the federal agents' pursuit cars. Junior absorbed this knowledge with the enthusiasm of a naturally mechanically inclined mind, learning to disassemble and reassemble engines, to modify carburetors, to tune ignition systems, and to perform the dozens of other mechanical tasks that the operation required. The knowledge was practical and specific, tailored to the demands of the enterprise rather than to the theoretical frameworks of formal engineering education. But the practical knowledge, accumulated over years of direct experience with machines and their behavior, produced a mechanical understanding that was as deep and as comprehensive as any formal education could have provided. The modification of the moonshine running cars was itself a form of motorsport engineering, conducted without the benefit of wind tunnels or dynamometers or computational analysis, but guided by the same fundamental principles that govern all vehicle performance. The runners modified their cars to go faster, to handle better on the mountain roads, and to carry the heavy loads of whiskey jars without sacrificing the performance needed to outrun the law. The modifications were empirical, developed through trial and error, and refined through the accumulated experience of men who had been modifying cars for the same purpose for decades. The knowledge was shared within the moonshine community, passed from one generation of runners to the next, creating a body of practical engineering knowledge that was as sophisticated, in its own way, as any body of knowledge in the formal engineering world. Johnson's transition from moonshine running modification to stock car racing modification was seamless, because the underlying skills were the same. The engines that powered the moonshine cars and the engines that powered the stock cars were the same types of engines, large displacement American V8s, that responded to the same modifications and that rewarded the same mechanical skills. The understanding of carburation, of ignition timing, of valve train dynamics, of the 100 other variables that determine an engine's power output and its reliability, was directly transferable from the illicit world of moonshine running to the legitimate world of professional racing. The Cup Series career that Johnson built between 1953 and 1966 was conducted with a ferocity and an intensity that reflected the man's fundamental character. Johnson was not a smooth, calculating driver in the way that David Pearson was smooth and calculating. He was a charger, a man who attacked the track with a physicality and a directness that were the on-track expressions of the same qualities that had made him one of the best moonshine runners in Wilkes County. He drove hard, he drove fast, and he drove with an absolute disregard for the consequences that made him simultaneously thrilling and terrifying to the drivers who competed against him. The 50 Cup victories were accumulated through a combination of raw speed, physical courage, and the mechanical advantage that Johnson's own preparation provided. Many of the cars that Johnson drove during his Cup career were cars that he had built or significantly modified himself, applying the mechanical knowledge that his moonshine background had provided to the challenge of creating competitive stock cars. The self-preparation was a competitive advantage, allowing Johnson to optimize his cars in ways that drivers who relied on others for their mechanical preparation could not match. The 47 pole positions were a measure of the outright speed that Johnson possessed, the ability to produce single-lap performances that were the fastest in the field. The pole position is a test of raw talent and car preparation, a measure of the maximum speed that the driver and the machine can produce under controlled conditions. Johnson's pole position total places him among the most prolific qualifiers in the sport's history and demonstrates that his driving ability was not merely effective in race conditions but was among the fastest in the field under any conditions. The decision not to run a full Cup schedule during some seasons of his career reflected the economic realities of the era and the competing demands on Johnson's time and resources. The moonshine operation, the farming, the mechanical work that supplemented his racing income, all of these activities required time and attention that a full-time Cup schedule would not have accommodated. The partial schedules that Johnson ran during some seasons reduced his total victory count below what a full-time schedule might have produced, but did not diminish the quality of his performance in the races he entered. The racing philosophy that Johnson carried throughout his driving career was built on the principle that the race was won in the garage as much as it was won on the track. The mechanical preparation that Johnson invested in his cars was the foundation of his competitive success, providing him with machines that were fast, reliable, and well-suited to the specific demands of each track on the schedule. The philosophy reflected the practical intelligence of a man who understood that talent alone was not sufficient, that the best driver in the field could not win if his car was not competitive, and that the investment of time and effort in mechanical preparation was as important as the investment of courage and skill in the actual racing. The relationships that Johnson maintained within the racing community during his driving years were characterized by the respect that his abilities commanded and by the directness of his personality. Johnson was not a politician or a diplomat. He said what he thought, he did what he intended, and he expected the same from the people around him. The directness could be abrasive, but it was also refreshing in a competitive environment that was sometimes characterized by the kind of indirect, passive-aggressive communication that the pressures of professional sport can produce. The competitiveness that Johnson demonstrated during his driving career was the product of the same internal fire that had driven him since his earliest years. The fire was not something that Johnson cultivated or performed. It was who he was, the fundamental expression of a character that could not accept defeat and that pursued victory with an intensity that was as natural and as involuntary as breathing. The fire burned in the moonshine running years, in the prison years, in the Cup Series years, and in the ownership years that followed. It was the constant, the unchanging element in a life that was otherwise characterized by transformation and change. The Holman-Moody connection during parts of Johnson's driving career provided him with factory-quality equipment that complemented his own mechanical abilities. Holman-Moody was the leading Ford racing preparation shop during the 1960s, supplying engines and chassis to Ford-affiliated teams across the Cup Series field. The access to Holman-Moody equipment gave Johnson cars that were among the best prepared in the field, and his ability to extract the maximum performance from this equipment was a reflection of his driving talent and his mechanical understanding. The rivalry with the other great drivers of his era, including Lee Petty, Buck Baker, Fireball Roberts, Fred Lorenzen, Ned Jarrett, and the young Richard Petty, provided the competitive context in which Johnson's abilities were tested and validated. The drivers who competed during the late 1950s and early 1960s constituted a generation of extraordinary talent, and Johnson's ability to win 50 races against this field was a measure of his competitive superiority. The specific track victories that punctuated Johnson's career included wins at the most prestigious venues on the schedule. The Daytona victories, which demonstrated his superspeedway mastery and his understanding of the drafting principle he had discovered. The Charlotte victories, which demonstrated his ability to compete at one of the sport's most demanding intermediate tracks. The Darlington victories, which demonstrated his precision and his car control at the track that was considered the most challenging on the circuit. And the short track victories at Bristol, Martinsville, Richmond, and the other tight physical ovals that rewarded the aggressive, confrontational driving style that was Johnson's natural mode. The relationship between Johnson and the Ford Motor Company, which provided the factory support for many of his Cup Series entries, was a significant dimension of his competitive success. The Ford racing program of the 1960s was one of the most aggressive and most successful manufacturer programs in the sport's history, and the engines and the technical support that the program provided to its affiliated teams gave them a competitive advantage that was difficult for the non-factory teams to match. Johnson's affiliation with the Ford program provided access to the latest engine technology, the most advanced chassis designs, and the engineering expertise of the manufacturer's racing division. The ownership transition that occurred after Johnson's driving retirement in 1966 was not an overnight transformation. Johnson spent several years developing his team's capabilities, building the infrastructure, the personnel, and the competitive resources that championship-level team ownership required. The development process was methodical and patient, reflecting the same disciplined approach that Johnson had brought to his own preparation as a driver, and that would characterize his management of the team throughout the ownership years. The Ingle Hollow facility where Johnson based his team operations was a reflection of the man himself, practical, efficient, and focused on the competitive mission rather than on the external appearances that some team owners valued. The facility was located near Johnson's home in Wilkes County, maintaining the geographic connection to the community that had shaped him and that remained the center of his personal life. The location was unconventional, far from the Charlotte area concentration of Cup Series teams, but it reflected Johnson's conviction that the quality of the work done inside the building was more important than the prestige of the address on the outside. The crew chief relationships that Johnson maintained during the ownership years were critical to the team's competitive success. The crew chiefs who worked for Johnson's team were among the best in the sport, attracted by the opportunity to work for one of the most successful and most innovative team owners in the Cup Series. Johnson's involvement in the technical dimensions of the team's preparation was more direct and more comprehensive than that of most team owners, reflecting his own mechanical expertise and his conviction that the team owner's role included not just the management of people and resources, but the direct contribution to the competitive preparation of the cars. The Yarborough Championships of 1976 through 1978 were the product of a partnership in which Johnson's engineering genius and Yarborough's driving ferocity combined to produce a level of dominance that the rest of the field could not match. Johnson built the cars, Yarborough drove them, and the combination, the engineer and the warrior, was the most formidable partnership in the sport during those 3 seasons. The specific innovations that Johnson developed during the Yarborough years included engine modifications that produced horsepower numbers that were consistently among the highest in the field, aerodynamic adjustments that optimized the car's body shape for different tracks and different conditions, and chassis setups that maximized the mechanical grip and the handling balance that Yarborough's aggressive driving style demanded. The innovations were the product of Johnson's mechanical intuition, refined through decades of direct experience with machines, and they provided the team with competitive advantages that were difficult for other teams to replicate. The Waltrip partnership that followed the Yarborough years required a different management approach that reflected the different personality and the different driving style of the new driver. Waltrip was talkative, where Yarborough had been taciturn. Waltrip was self-promoting, where Yarborough had been stoic. Waltrip demanded attention and affirmation in ways that Yarborough had not. The management of these differences was a test of Johnson's leadership skills and his ability to adapt his approach to the specific needs of the individual driver was one of the qualities that made him a great team owner. The 1981 championship, the first with Waltrip, was a season that demonstrated the team's ability to produce championship results with a driver whose strengths and weaknesses were different from Yarborough's. Waltrip won 12 races that season, a total that reflected the quality of the cars that Johnson built and the driving talent that Waltrip brought to the partnership. The 12-win season was one of the most productive in the sport's history and established the Waltrip-Johnson partnership as the dominant force in the Cup Series. The 1982 championship, the second with Waltrip, confirmed the partnership's competitive superiority and demonstrated that the 1981 title had not been an anomaly, but the product of a sustained competitive advantage that the rest of the field could not match. The back-to-back championships were a statement of dominance that echoed the Yarborough three-peat, and that cemented Johnson's reputation as a team owner whose competitive intelligence could produce champions regardless of the specific driver behind the wheel. The 1985 championship, the third with Waltrip, completed the second trilogy and brought Johnson's ownership championship total to 6, a number that placed him among the most successful team owners in the sport's history. The 6 championships, 3 with Yarborough and 3 with Waltrip, demonstrated that Johnson's ability to produce champions was not dependent on any single driver, but was a product of his own competitive genius and his own organizational capabilities. The financial management of the racing operation during Johnson's ownership years was characterized by the same practical efficiency that defined every other aspect of his approach. Johnson ran a lean operation, investing his resources where they would produce the greatest competitive return, and avoiding the unnecessary expenditures that could drain a team's finances without contributing to its performance. The financial discipline was a competitive advantage in an era when many teams struggled with the economics of Cup Series competition, and it allowed Johnson to maintain his team's competitiveness over a span of decades. The sponsorship relationships that supported Johnson's ownership career were a reflection of the commercial value that his team's competitive success generated. The major sponsors who invested in the team's cars received exposure and credibility that justified their investment, and the commercial relationships were managed with the same attention to detail and the same commitment to performance that Johnson brought to every other dimension of the enterprise. The Bill Elliott era at Junior Johnson Racing, which spanned the late 1980s and early 1990s, was a period of transition that reflected the changing competitive dynamics of the Cup Series. Elliott, who had won the 1988 championship with the Melling Racing team, brought a different set of skills to the Johnson operation. The partnership produced victories, but did not achieve the championship success that the Yarborough and Waltrip partnerships had delivered. The relative decline reflected both the increasing depth of the Cup Series competition and the challenges of maintaining competitive superiority over a span that had already extended beyond 2 decades. The retirement from team ownership in the mid-1990s was the conclusion of a competitive involvement that had encompassed 4 decades and that had produced achievements in multiple dimensions that no other figure in the sport's history could match. The retirement was driven by a combination of factors, including the changing economics of the sport, the increasing cost of maintaining a competitive operation, and the recognition that the competitive landscape had evolved beyond the point where a single car, owner-operated team could consistently compete with the multi-car megateams that were dominating the Cup Series. The racing community of the 1950s that Junior Johnson entered as a competitor was a tightly knit fraternity of men who shared a common love of speed and a common acceptance of the dangers that speed entailed. The community was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and the relationships between the drivers, the mechanics, and the team owners were personal and direct in a way that the larger, more corporate racing community of later decades could not replicate. The intimacy of the community created bonds that were deep and durable, sustained by shared experience and by the mutual recognition that the men who competed together were engaged in an enterprise that placed them all equally in the presence of danger. Johnson's position within this community was one of respect, and in some cases, wariness. His reputation for driving aggression, combined with the physical toughness that his background had instilled in him, made him a formidable figure both on and off the track. The other drivers respected his ability and were cautious of his competitive intensity, understanding that Johnson was a man who would not be intimidated, who would not yield a position willingly, and who was willing to take risks that more cautious men would avoid. The races that Johnson won during the 1950s and early 1960s were contested on a schedule that bore little resemblance to the modern Cup Series calendar. The schedule included as many as 50 or 60 events per season, contested at a bewildering variety of venues that ranged from tiny quarter-mile dirt ovals to the massive superspeedways at Daytona and Charlotte. The variety demanded a breadth of driving ability that modern drivers who compete primarily on a standardized set of paved ovals, are not required to demonstrate. Johnson's ability to win on dirt and on pavement, on short tracks and on superspeedways, was a measure of the comprehensive nature of his driving talent and of the adaptability that his varied background had developed. The financial structure of Cup Series competition during Johnson's driving career was modest by modern standards. The purses were small, the sponsorship revenue was minimal, and the financial rewards of even a successful racing career were far from lavish. Many drivers supplemented their racing income with outside employment, and the financial insecurity that accompanied a career in professional racing was a constant concern. Johnson managed the financial dimensions of his career with the same practical intelligence that he brought to the mechanical and competitive dimensions, ensuring that his racing activities were financially sustainable, even when the purses were modest. The partnership between the racing career and the agricultural operations that Johnson maintained throughout his life created a lifestyle that was uniquely grounded in the physical realities of rural America. The racing provided the excitement, the competition, and the public recognition that fed Johnson's competitive spirit. The farming provided the stability, the routine, and the connection to the land that grounded his identity and that kept him connected to the values and the community that had shaped him. The dual identity, racer and farmer, was not a contradiction. It was a synthesis, a way of life that honored both the competitive ambition and the rural authenticity that were equally important dimensions of Johnson's character. The farm was the anchor, the racing was the adventure, and the man who lived both was richer for the balance between them, drawing from each the qualities that the other could not provide. The specific mechanics of the moonshine operation that Johnson's family conducted in Wilkes County deserve some examination because they illuminate the practical skills that Johnson developed before he ever sat in a race car. The production of corn whiskey was a craft that required knowledge of agriculture, of chemistry, of mechanics, and of logistics. The corn had to be grown, harvested, and processed. The mash had to be prepared according to recipe that had been passed down through generations of distillers. The still had to be constructed, maintained, and operated with a precision that ensured the quality and the consistency of the product. And the finished whiskey had to be packaged, transported, and distributed through a network of buyers that required management and communication skills. The driving dimension of the moonshine trade was the skill that most directly translated to stock car racing. The runners drove their modified cars on roads that were narrow, winding, steep, and unpaved, at speeds that would have been dangerous in daylight, and that were borderline suicidal in the darkness that the runners preferred. The driving required reflexes, car control, spatial awareness, and the courage to maintain speed in conditions of limited visibility and maximum danger. The skills were honed through repetition, refined through the life or death consequences that poor performance could produce, and internalized to a degree that made them instinctive rather than conscious. The federal authorities who pursued the moonshiners were themselves skilled drivers, equipped with vehicles that were faster and better maintained than the typical civilian car. The ability to outrun the federal pursuit cars required modifications to the moonshine vehicles that anticipated the performance enhancements that stock car racing would later formalize. The engines were bored out, producing more horsepower. The suspensions were modified, improving the handling on the rough roads. The brakes were upgraded, allowing for harder braking in the turns. The modifications were the same types of modifications that stock car racing teams would later make to their competition vehicles, and the knowledge that the moonshine community accumulated about the effects of these modifications on vehicle performance was a body of practical engineering knowledge that was directly transferable to the racing world. The arrest at the family still in 1956 was a watershed moment that forced Johnson to confront the legal consequences of the life he had been living. The arrest was not unexpected. The federal authorities had been increasing their pressure on the moonshine operations in Wilkes County for years, and the likelihood of arrest was a risk that every moonshiner accepted as part of the trade. But the reality of the arrest the handcuffs and the courtroom and the prison sentence, was a confrontation with consequences that the abstract awareness of risk had not fully prepared Johnson for. The prison experience, while difficult, was also formative. Johnson has described the 11 months of incarceration as a period of reflection and resolution, a time during which he assessed the direction of his life and committed himself to a future that would be built on legitimate achievement rather than illegal enterprise. The commitment was genuine and was maintained for the rest of his life. The prison sentence was the end of the outlaw chapter and the beginning of the champion chapter, and the transition between the two was the most significant personal transformation of Johnson's life. The return to racing after the prison sentence was accompanied by a changed perspective but an unchanged talent. Johnson's driving abilities had not been diminished by the time away from the track, and his performances in the races following his release were as impressive as anything he had produced before the incarceration. The continuity of talent, maintained through the disruption of the prison sentence, was evidence of the depth and the permanence of Johnson's driving abilities that were so deeply embedded in his neuromuscular system and in his cognitive processes that a period of forced inactivity could not significantly erode them. The competitive peak of Johnson's driving career coincided with the late 1950s and early 1960s, a period when the sport was undergoing a rapid evolution in the quality of its competition, the sophistication of its equipment, and the scale of its venues. Johnson competed at the highest level during this period, producing victories and pole positions at rates that placed him among the very best in the field. The peak years were characterized by a dominance that reflected the full expression of Johnson's abilities, the mechanical knowledge, the driving skill, the competitive ferocity, and the physical courage combining to produce a body of work that was extraordinary by any standard. The competitive relationships that Johnson maintained during his driving career included rivalries with some of the most prominent drivers of the era. Lee Petty, the patriarch of the Petty dynasty, was a fierce competitor whose methodical approach to racing contrasted with Johnson's more aggressive style. Fireball Roberts, the Florida driver whose charisma and superspeedway expertise made him one of the sport's first genuine stars, was a rival whose talent demanded Johnson's best effort. Buck Baker, the two-time champion from Charlotte, was a veteran whose experience and competitive intelligence provided a consistent challenge. Rex White, Ned Jarrett, and the other champions of the era all competed against Johnson, and all acknowledged the quality of the competition he provided. The retirement from driving in 1966 was not preceded by the kind of public farewell that modern drivers receive. Johnson simply stopped racing full-time, transitioning from the cockpit to the garage with the same efficiency and the same absence of sentimentality that characterized every other transition in his life. The retirement was not the end of his competitive involvement. It was the beginning of a new phase, the ownership phase, that would prove to be even more successful than the driving phase, and that would extend his impact on the sport for another 3 decades. The first defining moment of Junior Johnson's career was the 1960 qualifying race at Daytona International Speedway, the event that introduced the concept of drafting to the world of stock car racing, and that transformed the way superspeedway races were contested. The story has been told many times, but its significance warrants retelling, because the discovery of drafting was not merely a technical innovation. It was a paradigm shift, a fundamental change in the understanding of the physics of high-speed racing that altered the competitive landscape of the sport permanently. Johnson arrived at Daytona with a Chevrolet that was significantly underpowered compared to the factory-backed Pontiacs that dominated the speed charts. The Pontiac engines, products of the manufacturer's substantial investment in the racing program, produced horsepower numbers that the Chevrolet could not match, and the speed differential on the long straightaways of the 2.5-mile superspeedway was substantial. By conventional racing's logic, Johnson should not have been competitive. The horsepower deficit was too large. The straightaway speed disadvantage was too significant. The mathematics of the situation argued against any outcome other than a mid-pack finish. But Johnson had noticed something during practice. that contradicted the mathematics. When he tucked his car behind one of the faster Pontiacs, running in the aerodynamic shadow of the car ahead, his speed increased dramatically. The phenomenon was physical, measurable, and repeatable. The car ahead was punching a hole in the air, creating a region of reduced air resistance behind it, and Johnson's car, running in that region, was able to travel at nearly the same speed as the faster car while using significantly less horsepower. The reduced air resistance meant that the engine did not need to work as hard to maintain speed, and the energy saved could be deployed at the critical moments when Johnson needed to pass. The insight was intuitive rather than analytical. Johnson did not understand the physics of aerodynamic drafting in the way that a trained engineer would understand it. He understood it in the way that a moonshine runner understood the roads of Wilkes County. Through feel, through instinct, through the accumulation of sensory information that the body processes faster than the mind can articulate. He felt the car accelerate when it entered the slipstream of the car ahead. He felt the reduced effort required to maintain speed, and he understood, with the practical intelligence that had sustained him through years of moonshine running and stock car racing, that the phenomenon could be exploited for competitive advantage. The race itself was a masterclass in the application of the drafting principle. Johnson positioned himself behind the faster Pontiacs, using the draft to keep pace with cars that were otherwise significantly faster than his own. He waited. He conserved. He ran in the slipstream, gathering speed without expending the horsepower that would have been required to run at the front on his own. And when the moment came, when the race reached its climactic stages and the positions at the front became the positions that mattered, Johnson used the accumulated advantage of the draft to make his move, slingshotting past the Pontiacs with a burst of speed that the draft had made possible and that his own car, running alone, could never have produced. The victory stunned the racing world. A Chevrolet beating the factory Pontiacs at Daytona was supposed to be impossible. The horsepower numbers said so. The straightaway speed tests said so. Everything that the conventional wisdom of the sport believed about the relationship between engine power and race results said so. And Junior Johnson, the moonshiner from Ronda, the convict, the man without a factory ride or a factory budget, had proven all of it wrong, using nothing but his feel for the car and his intuitive understanding of a physical principle that the sports engineers had not yet identified. The impact of the drafting discovery extended far beyond the individual race. It changed the way superspeedway events were contested for the next 6 decades and counting. The pack racing that characterizes modern Daytona and Talladega events, the tight formations of cars running nose to tail at speeds exceeding 190 miles per hour, is a direct descendant of the principle that Johnson discovered during that practice session. Every driver who has ever used the draft to gain an advantage, every team that has ever incorporated drafting strategy into its superspeedway preparation, every race that has been decided by a last-lap slingshot pass, owes a debt to the intuitive genius of a man who felt the physics before anyone could explain them. The second defining moment was the prison sentence and the return from it. The arrest at the family moonshine, still in 1956, was the collision between the two worlds that Johnson inhabited, the illegal world of moonshine production and the increasingly legitimate world of professional stock car racing. The federal conviction and the 11-month prison sentence were the consequences of a life that had been lived straddling the line between the two worlds, and the experience of incarceration was a forced reckoning with the costs of that straddling. Johnson has described the prison experience with characteristic economy and directness. He did his time. He did not complain. He used the period of incarceration to reflect on the direction of his life and to commit himself to the pursuit of a legitimate career that would not expose him to the legal risks that the moonshine trade carried. The commitment was genuine and was honored for the rest of his life. Johnson's post-prison career was conducted entirely within the boundaries of the law, and the success he achieved after the prison sentence was a testament to the talent and the determination that had been evident from his earliest racing days. The return to racing after the prison sentence was a moment of redemption that the racing community embraced with a warmth that reflected the affection they held for Johnson and the recognition that the moonshine conviction, however legally justified, was the product of a culture and a time that the sport itself had emerged from. Johnson was not judged harshly for the conviction. He was welcomed back to the track with the understanding that the moonshine running, whatever its legal status, was part of the heritage of the sport, and that the man who had done it and who had paid the price for it deserved the opportunity to continue his career. The numbers are striking when you examine Johnson's career statistics in their full context. 50 Cup Series victories in 313 starts, 47 pole positions, a winning percentage of nearly 16%. The statistics describe a driver who was, on a per-race basis, one of the most productive competitors in the sport's history. The winning percentage places Johnson in the company of David Pearson and Richard Petty, the only drivers whose per-race productivity was comparable. The pole position total reflects the raw speed that Johnson possessed, the ability to produce single-lap performances that were the fastest in the field. The transition to team ownership in 1966 was the beginning of the second act of Johnson's racing life, and the second act was, by any measure, more successful than the first. The 140 victories that Johnson's teams produced as an owner exceeded his 50 victories as a driver by a factor of nearly 3, and the 6 championships dwarfed the 0 championships that his driving career had produced. The irony is rich. The man who was one of the most talented drivers of his era never won a Cup championship as a driver. The man who built and managed teams won 6. The Yarborough partnership that launched the ownership era was built on a foundation of shared values and complementary skills. Yarborough was the warrior, the driver whose physical courage and competitive intensity were the equal of any driver in the field. Johnson was the strategist, the builder, the man whose understanding of the car and the track and the competitive dynamics of a race was the foundation on which the championship campaigns were constructed. The partnership produced 3 consecutive championships, a feat that was unprecedented when it occurred, and that was matched only decades later by Jimmy Johnson's 5 consecutive title run. The engineering innovations that Johnston developed during the ownership years were as significant as the drafting discovery had been during the driving years. Johnson was a master of the grey areas in the NASCAR rulebook, a man whose ability to find competitive advantage in the spaces between what was explicitly permitted and what was explicitly prohibited was legendary. His cars were fast, often controversially so, and the inspections that NASCAR conducted frequently resulted in discoveries that tested the boundaries of the regulations without clearly exceeding them. The gamesmanship was part of the competitive culture of the era, and Johnson played the game with a skill and a creativity that his competitors could not consistently match. The engine development programs that Johnson operated produced horsepower numbers that were consistently among the highest in the field. Johnson's background as a mechanic and as a driver gave him an intuitive understanding of what an engine needed to produce maximum power reliably, and the engines that his shop built were products of this understanding, combining the theoretical knowledge of the engineering discipline with the practical knowledge of a man who had been building and tuning engines since his teenage years. The Waltrip partnership that produced the second trilogy of championships was a different kind of collaboration than the Yarborough partnership. Waltrip was a more complex personality than Yarborough, more verbal, more self-promoting, more demanding of attention and affirmation. The management of Waltrip's personality required a different approach than the management of Yarborough's, and Johnson adapted with the flexibility that effective leadership demands. The adaptability was itself a competitive skill, the ability to match the management approach to the specific needs and characteristics of the individual being managed. The 3 championships that the Waltrip partnership produced in 1981, 1982, and 1985 cemented Johnson's reputation as a team owner of the highest caliber. The 6 total championships, 3 with Yarborough and 3 with Waltrip, placed Johnson alongside the most successful team owners in the history of the sport, and demonstrated that his ability to win championships was not dependent on any single driver, but was a product of his own competitive intelligence, and his own organizational capabilities. The Bill Elliott partnership in the late 1980s and early 1990s added another chapter to the ownership career, though it did not produce the championships that the Yarborough and Waltrip partnerships had delivered. Elliott, who had won the 1988 Cup Championship with the Melling Racing team, brought a different set of skills and a different personality to the Johnson operation, and the partnership produced victories and competitive seasons without reaching the championship level. The relative decline in championship results during the Elliott years reflected both the increasing competitiveness of the Cup Series field and the evolution of the sport's organizational model, which was moving toward the multi-car megateams that would eventually dominate the competition. The retirement from team ownership in the mid-1990s was the conclusion of a competitive involvement in the sport that had spanned more than 4 decades, from the moonshine roads of Wilkes County through the dirt tracks and the superspeedways of the Cup Series circuit to the championship stages, where the sport's highest honors were distributed. The retirement was quiet, consistent with the character of a man who had always preferred the substance of competition to the spectacle of public display. The NASCAR Hall of Fame induction in 2010 as a member of the inaugural class alongside Richard Petty, Dale Earnhardt, Bill France Sr., and Bill France Jr. was the formal recognition of a career that had shaped the sport from its origins to its modern form. The placement in the inaugural class was significant, an acknowledgement that Johnson's contributions to the sport were on the same level as those of its most celebrated figures, and that his impact, as both a driver and an owner, was among the most comprehensive in the sport's history. The post-retirement life that Johnson built in his native Wilkes County was a return to the land and the community that had shaped him. He maintained his farming operations, tended his cattle, and lived the life of a prosperous rural North Carolinian whose public days were behind him, but whose reputation preceded him wherever he went. The retirement was not idleness. It was a different kind of productivity, a return to the rhythms of the agricultural life that had been the foundation of his identity before the racing career had carried him to fame. The passing of Junior Johnson on December 20th, 2019, at the age of 88, was the end of a life that had encompassed more drama, more achievement, and more transformation than most lives can contain. The tributes that followed his death came from across the racing community and beyond, acknowledging the extraordinary scope of what he had accomplished, and the indelible mark he had left on the sport and the culture that had produced him. The tributes acknowledged the moonshine running, the prison sentence, the driving career, the drafting discovery, the ownership career, the championships, and the presidential pardon, each element of the story receiving its due recognition in the collective assessment of a life that had been, by any measure, one of the most remarkable in the history of American sport. The engineering philosophy that Junior Johnson brought to his team ownership career was rooted in the practical knowledge he had accumulated over decades of building and modifying race cars. Johnson's approach was empirical rather than theoretical, based on direct observation and hands-on experimentation, rather than on the computational analysis and simulation tools that modern teams employ. The approach was effective because Johnson's intuitive understanding of vehicle dynamics and engine performance was so deep and so refined that it could produce insights that the more analytical approaches of his competitors could not always match. The engine program that Johnson operated during his ownership years was one of the most closely guarded aspects of the team's competitive operation. Johnson built his engines in-house, supervising the assembly and the tuning of each engine with a meticulous attention to detail that reflected his conviction that the engine was the heart of the competitive package and that the investment of time and expertise in engine development was the most productive use of the team's resources. The engines that Johnson's shop produced were consistently among the most powerful and most reliable in the field, providing the foundation on which the team's competitive success was built. The aerodynamic innovations that Johnson developed during the ownership years were another dimension of his engineering genius. Johnson understood that the body of the car was not just a cosmetic element, but a functional one, that the shape of the body affected the way the air flowed around and over the car, and that modifications to the body shape could produce significant changes in the car's speed and handling. The aerodynamic modifications that Johnson made were often subtle, small changes in the angles and the contours of the body panels that were difficult to detect during inspection, but that produced measurable improvements in the car's aerodynamic performance. The relationship between Johnson's engineering approach and the NASCAR rulebook was a constant source of tension and creativity. Johnson was a master of the grey areas, the spaces in the rulebook between what was explicitly permitted and what was explicitly prohibited. He operated in these spaces with a creativity and a boldness that produced competitive advantages that his rivals could not always match, and that NASCAR's inspectors could not always identify. The relationship between Johnson and the inspectors was a cat-and-mouse game that added a dimension of drama to the competitive enterprise, and that contributed to the legend of Junior Johnson as a man whose ingenuity was as formidable as his courage. The specific rule interpretations that Johnson developed during his ownership career are part of the sport's folklore, stories of modifications and innovations that pushed the boundaries of legality without clearly exceeding them. The stories are numerous and varied, encompassing engine modifications, body alterations, fuel system innovations, and chassis adjustments that demonstrated Johnson's ability to find competitive advantage in the spaces between the rules. The innovations were not cheating, at least not in Johnson's view. They were the natural expression of a competitive intelligence that saw the rulebook not as a set of constraints, but as a set of opportunities, a document that defined the boundaries of the playing field and that rewarded the men who were clever enough to play the field most effectively. The relationship between Johnson and the NASCAR officials who enforced the rules was complex and sometimes contentious. The officials respected Johnson's competitive abilities and his contributions to the sport, but they also recognized that his innovations sometimes tested the limits of what the rules intended, and the tensions between the team's interpretations and the officials' enforcement produced occasional conflicts that were resolved through the inspections, the protests, and the penalty processes that the sport's governance structure provided. The influence of Johnson's engineering innovations on the broader competitive landscape of the Cup Series was significant. The innovations that Johnson developed were often adopted in modified form by other teams, spreading through the garage as the competitive community recognized the advantages that the innovations provided. The spread of innovation was one of the mechanisms through which the Cup Series field maintained its competitive depth, ensuring that the advantages that any single team developed were eventually shared across the field, and that the competitive balance was maintained over time. The organizational management skills that Johnson demonstrated during his ownership career were as important as his engineering abilities in producing the team's competitive results. The management of the personnel, the coordination of the preparation schedule, the allocation of resources across the competitive, commercial, and logistical dimensions of the operation, all of these required managerial competence that went beyond the mechanical expertise that was Johnson's most visible skill. Johnson managed his operation with the same directness and the same efficiency that characterized every other aspect of his approach, creating an organizational culture that valued competence, effort, and results above all other considerations. The sponsor relationship management that Johnson conducted during the ownership years was another dimension of the business skills that the competitive enterprise required. The sponsors who invested in the team expected not just on-track performance, but a range of off-track activities, including promotional events, corporate appearances, and the maintenance of a public image that was consistent with the sponsor's brand values. Johnson managed these relationships with the same practical effectiveness that he brought to the engineering and the competitive dimensions of the operation, understanding that the sponsor revenue was the financial foundation on which the team's competitive capabilities depended. The talent development dimension of Johnson's ownership career extended beyond the Yarborough and Waltrip partnerships to include the development of the mechanics, the engineers, and the support personnel who made up the team's competitive infrastructure. Johnson trained his people with the same thoroughness that he applied to his car preparation, instilling in them the mechanical knowledge, the work ethic, and the competitive standards that the championship-level operation required. Many of the men who worked for Johnson during the ownership years went on to successful careers with other teams, carrying with them the knowledge and the values that they had acquired under Johnson's leadership. The personal relationship between Johnson and his drivers was characterized by the mutual respect that effective professional partnerships require. Johnson expected his drivers to be fast, to be competitive, and to conduct themselves with a professionalism that reflected well on the team and its sponsors. The expectations were high, but were accompanied by the organizational support and the competitive resources that made meeting them possible. The drivers who succeeded in the Johnson operation thrived in the environment of high expectations and high support. The drivers who did not fit the culture, who could not adapt to Johnson's directness and his demands, moved on to other teams. The financial performance of Johnson's racing operation over the decades of its existence was a reflection of the commercial value that competitive success generated. The championships and the victories attracted sponsors, and the sponsor revenue allowed the team to invest in the equipment, the personnel, and the facilities that competitive success required. The virtuous cycle of success generating revenue, generating further success, was the economic engine that sustained the operation, and Johnson's management of this cycle was one of the factors that allowed the team to maintain its competitiveness over such an extended period. The specific championship campaigns that Johnson's teams produced during the ownership years were each distinctive in their competitive character and their narrative arc. The Yarborough years were characterized by domination, by the overwhelming superiority of the Johnson-Yarborough combination over the rest of the field. The Waltrip years were characterized by a different kind of success, one that was built on the chemistry between Johnson's engineering and Waltrip's driving talent, and that produced championships through a combination of speed and consistency. The Elliott years were competitive, but did not achieve the championship success that the earlier partnerships had delivered, reflecting the evolving competitive landscape and the increasing difficulty of maintaining dominance over an extended period. Each championship campaign required a different set of strategic decisions, a different allocation of resources, and a different management approach. Johnson's ability to adapt his approach to the specific circumstances of each campaign was one of the qualities that made him a great team owner, a leader whose competitive intelligence was flexible enough to respond to changing conditions, and whose organizational skills were comprehensive enough to manage the complex, multi-dimensional enterprise that championship-level Cup Series competition requires. The decision to retire from team ownership was made with the same practicality that had characterized every other major decision of Johnson's career. The economics of the sport were changing. The costs of maintaining a competitive operation were increasing. The multi-car teams that were coming to dominate the Cup Series possessed resources and organizational capabilities that a single-car operation could not match. Johnson recognized that the competitive landscape had evolved beyond the point where his approach, however successful it had been in the past, could continue to produce championship results, and he made the decision to step away with the same directness and the same absence of sentimentality that had characterized every other aspect of his professional life. The Daytona legacy that Johnson established through his driving career, and that was extended through his ownership career, is one of the most significant in the track's history. Johnson's discovery of drafting at Daytona changed the way races at the superspeedway were contested, and the impact of that discovery has been felt in every Daytona event in the 6 decades since. The drafting principle that Johnson identified during a practice session became the foundational strategic element of superspeedway racing, the technique that every driver must master and that every team must incorporate into its competitive preparation. The symbolic significance of the Daytona connection extends beyond the technical dimension. Daytona is the sport's most important venue. The track where the Daytona 500, the Great American Race, is held each February, and the association between Johnson and Daytona connects the sport's most mythologized figure to its most prestigious event. The connection gives the Daytona 500 an additional layer of historical resonance, a reminder that the race and the racing that takes place during it are built on a foundation that includes the intuitive genius of a moonshine runner who felt the physics of the draft before anyone could explain them. The specific races that Johnson won during his ownership career included victories at every type of track on the Cup schedule, from the superspeedways to the short tracks to the intermediate ovals. The 140 victories were distributed across the full range of venues, demonstrating that the team's competitiveness was comprehensive rather than specialized, and that the engineering and the strategic capabilities that Johnson provided were sufficient to produce results on every type of track. The post-racing life that Johnson built in Wilkes County after his retirement from team ownership was a return to the rhythms of the rural life that had been his foundation. The farming, the cattle, the land, these were the constants that had sustained Johnson through every stage of his career, and that provided the structure for his retirement years. Johnson maintained his connection to the racing community through occasional appearances and through the relationships he had built over 4 decades of competition, but the center of his life was the farm, the land, and the community that had always been home. The Midnight Moon brand of legal corn whiskey that Johnson endorsed in his later years was a delicious irony, a legitimate commercial enterprise that capitalized on the moonshine mythology that had been central to Johnson's personal story. The endorsement connected Johnson's present to his past in a way that was both commercially savvy and culturally significant, demonstrating that the moonshine heritage that had once been a legal liability had become, in the decades since Johnson's career, had transformed the narrative. A commercial asset. The recognition that Johnson received during his later years, including the Hall of Fame induction and the numerous tributes and honors that the racing community bestowed upon him, was a confirmation of the impact that his life and career had made on the sport. The recognition was deserved and was received with the characteristic directness and the lack of sentimentality that defined Johnson's approach to every public occasion. He accepted the honors, he acknowledged the significance, and he returned to his farm in Wilkes County, to the land and the community that had always been the center of his world. The mentoring relationships that Johnson maintained during his later years connected his knowledge and his experience to the younger generations of racing competitors and team owners who were building the modern version of the sport. The men and women who sought Johnson's counsel during his retirement years recognized that his competitive intelligence and his practical knowledge of the sport were resources that could not be replicated by any amount of data analysis or simulation technology. The knowledge that Johnson carried was experiential, earned through decades of direct involvement at every level of the racing enterprise, and it was offered to those who sought it with the same directness and the same generosity that characterized every other dimension of Johnson's character. The health challenges that accompanied Johnson's later years were managed with the same toughness and the same refusal to complain that had characterized his approach to every challenge throughout his life. Johnson's physical decline in the years preceding his death was gradual and was handled with a privacy and a dignity that reflected the values of a man who had never sought public attention for personal matters and who preferred to manage his private affairs outside the view of the public eye. The December 2019 passing was the conclusion of a life that had encompassed more chapters, more transformations, and more significance than almost any other life in the history of American sport. The moonshine runner, the convict, the driver, the innovator, the team owner, the champion, the legend. Each chapter would have been a remarkable life on its own. Together, they constituted a narrative that was as extraordinary as anything the sport or the country had produced. The tributes that followed Johnson's death were as diverse as the dimensions of the life they honored. The racing community mourned the loss of one of its founding figures. The cultural commentators reflected on the significance of the moonshine to champion narrative that had made Johnson an American icon. The Wilkes County community mourned the loss of its most famous son, and the broader American public, many of whom knew Johnson's story through the Tom Wolfe article or through the general cultural mythology that surrounded his name, acknowledged the passing of a figure who had embodied some of the most enduring themes of the American experience. The Yarborough recruitment was one of the most important personnel decisions in the history of Cup Series team ownership. Cale Yarborough, at the time Johnson recruited him, was a talented but underachieving driver whose career had produced victories but not the sustained championship-level performance that his talent suggested was possible. Many observers viewed Yarborough as too wild, too undisciplined, too willing to take unnecessary risks to be a reliable championship contender. Johnson saw something different. He saw, beneath the wildness and the inconsistency, a driver whose physical courage and competitive intensity were the equal of anyone in the field, and who, given the right equipment and the right organizational environment, could sustain the championship-level performance that his talent made possible. The recruitment was an act of judgment that would be vindicated by 3 consecutive championships. The Yarborough who arrived at Johnson's shop was a different driver from the Yarborough who emerged 3 years later with 3 championship trophies. The transformation was produced by the combination of Johnson's engineering excellence, his strategic guidance, and his management of Yarborough's competitive personality, a management approach that channeled the driver's natural aggression into productive, competitive performance, rather than allowing it to dissipate in unnecessary confrontations and reckless driving. The chemistry between Johnson and Yarborough was the chemistry of complementary strengths. Johnson was the thinker, the planner, the man who understood the car and the strategy and the competitive dynamics at an intellectual level that most team owners could not match. Yarborough was the doer, the warrior, the man who executed the plan with a physical courage and a competitive ferocity that no other driver could replicate. The combination was devastating, producing a 3-year run of dominance that established both men as legends and that set the standard against which all subsequent team driver partnerships would be measured. The Waltrip recruitment was a different kind of challenge, requiring Johnson to manage a personality that was more complex and more demanding than Yarborough's. Waltrip was not just a driver, he was a performer, a showman, a man who demanded attention and who used his public persona as a competitive tool. The management of Waltrip's personality was a test of Johnson's leadership skills, and his ability to channel Waltrip's energy and his talent into championship performance was one of the most impressive demonstrations of managerial competence in the sport's history. The 3 championships that the Waltrip partnership produced in 1981, 1982, and 1985 were each distinct in their competitive character. The 1981 championship, with 12 victories, was a season of overwhelming dominance that announced the Waltrip-Johnson partnership as the new force in the sport. The 1982 championship, with 12 more victories, confirmed the partnership's sustained competitive superiority. The 1985 championship, with 3 victories, was a more strategically managed campaign that demonstrated the team's ability to win a championship through consistency and point management rather than through raw speed alone. The versatility of the winning approach, the ability to produce championships through both overwhelming dominance and strategic management, was a reflection of Johnson's adaptability as a team leader. He was not a one-dimensional manager who could produce results only through a single approach. He was a multi-dimensional leader who could adjust his strategy and his management style to the specific circumstances of each championship campaign, producing results through whatever combination of speed, consistency, and strategy the particular situation demanded. The competitive culture that Johnson created within his team during the ownership years was characterized by a single overriding principle. The only acceptable result was winning. The principle was applied with a consistency and a rigor that left no room for complacencies or for the acceptance of mediocre results. The men who worked for Johnson understood that the standard was absolute and that the consequences of falling short of the standard were real and immediate. The culture was demanding, sometimes brutally so, but it was also motivating, creating an environment in which the pursuit of excellence was not just encouraged but expected, and in which the reward for meeting the standard was the satisfaction of working for one of the most successful operations in the sport. The work ethic that Johnson demanded from his team was a reflection of his own work ethic, the habit of relentless, purposeful effort that had been instilled in him by the agricultural and mechanical work of his youth, and that he maintained throughout his adult life. Johnson was not a man who delegated and supervised from a distance. He was a hands-on participant in the preparation of the cars, a man whose fingerprints were literally on the engines and the chassis that went to the track each weekend. The direct involvement was a source of competitive advantage because it ensured that the cars were prepared to the standards that only the man who would be held responsible for the results could enforce. The pit crew operations that Johnson's team conducted during the ownership years were characterized by the same efficiency and the same attention to detail that marked every other dimension of the team's competitive preparation. The pit stops were quick, clean, and consistent, reflecting the practice and the preparation that Johnson demanded from every member of the team. The seconds saved on pit road were the product of hours of practice and of the same relentless pursuit of perfection that Johnson applied to every other aspect of the racing enterprise. The sponsor relationships that supported Johnson's team during the ownership years evolved as the sport's commercial landscape changed. The Anheuser-Busch sponsorship that adorned the Waltrip car was one of the most prominent and most successful sponsorship relationships of the era, associating one of America's largest consumer brands with one of the sport's most successful teams. The Budweiser colors that the number 11 car wore became one of the most recognizable liveries in the Cup Series field, and the commercial success of the partnership demonstrated the value that competitive success could generate for corporate sponsors. The relationship between Johnson and the France family, which owned and operated NASCAR, was a complex and sometimes contentious relationship that reflected the broader tensions between the sport's competitors and its governing body. Johnson respected the Francis' vision for the sport and their role in building the enterprise from its modest origins to its national prominence, but he also pushed back against the rules and the enforcement decisions that he believed were unfair or that limited his team's ability to compete. The pushback was characteristic of Johnson's approach to every authority he encountered, from the federal revenue agents of his moonshine running days to the NASCAR officials of his team ownership years. Johnson respected authority, but did not defer to it, and the tension between his independent spirit and the governing body's regulatory authority was a recurring theme of his involvement in the sport. The legacy of the 6 championships that Johnson's teams won as an owner is a legacy that extends beyond the individual results to encompass the organizational model and the competitive philosophy that produced them. The model of the hands-on, technically engaged team owner who understands the engineering as deeply as the management and who is directly involved in the preparation of the competitive equipment was the model that Johnson established and that influenced every team owner who aspired to championship success. The model is increasingly rare in the modern era of corporate team ownership and professional management, but its influence persists in the competitive culture of the sport, a reminder that the most effective racing organizations are often the ones in which the leadership is directly connected to the competitive product. The Bill Elliott chapter of the ownership career, while less successful than the Yarborough and Waltrip chapters, was nonetheless significant for the competitive results it produced and for the challenges it revealed. Elliott, who had won the 1988 Cup Championship with the Melling Racing team, was one of the most popular and most talented drivers of his generation. The partnership with Johnson produced victories and competitive seasons, but it did not produce the championships that the earlier partnerships had delivered. The relative decline reflected the increasing competitiveness of the Cup Series field and the growing resource gap between the multi-car megateams and the single-car operations like Johnson's. The recognition that the competitive landscape was evolving beyond the capabilities of his operational model was one of the factors that contributed to Johnson's decision to retire from team ownership. The megateams that were emerging in the 1990s, organizations like Hendrick Motorsports and Rash Racing that fielded multiple cars with budgets that dwarfed Johnson's, were establishing a new standard of competitive investment that the single-car model could not match. Johnson, who had always operated with the lean, efficient approach that his character and his resources demanded, recognized that the era of the single-car championship team was ending, and that the future of the sport belonged to the larger, more corporate organizations that the modern competitive landscape required. The decision to retire was made with the same practicality and the same directness that characterized every other major decision of Johnson's life. He did not linger. He did not engage in a prolonged farewell. He assessed the situation, made his determination, and acted on it. The retirement was the end of a competitive involvement that had spanned more than 4 decades, and it was conducted with a dignity and a completeness that were appropriate for a career of such extraordinary scope and significance. The competitive significance of the 6 ownership championships is best appreciated in the context of the fields against which they were won. The Yarborough Championships of 1976 through 1978 were won against a field that included Richard Petty at the height of his powers, David Pearson in his prime, and Bobby Allison building one of the greatest careers in the sport's history. The Waltrip Championships of 1981, 1982, and 1985 were won against fields that included Bobby Allison, Richard Petty, Dale Earnhardt, Terry Labonte, and the other talented drivers who constituted the deepest competitive generation in the sport's modern history. The ability to produce champions against these fields year after year, with different drivers and different competitive approaches, was the most compelling evidence of Johnson's genius as a team owner. The championships were not the product of a single lucky season or a single dominant driver. They were the product of sustained competitive excellence, maintained over a decade and a half through changes in drivers, changes in rules, and changes in the competitive landscape that would have overwhelmed a less capable organization. The deeper truth about Junior Johnson is that he was the most complete figure in the history of American motorsport, a man who excelled in every role the sport offered: driver, mechanic, engineer, strategist, team owner, talent scout, and innovator, and who left his mark on the sport in each of these capacities with a depth and a permanence that no other individual has matched. Others have been better drivers, others have been more successful team owners, others have been more famous, more celebrated, more thoroughly mythologized by the media and the culture, but no one has been all of these things at the level that Johnson achieved. And the completeness of his contribution is the quality that sets him apart from every other figure in the sport's history. Let that sink in. Junior Johnson was not a specialist. He was a polymath. The same man who ran moonshine in the dark, who discovered drafting at Daytona, who won 50 Cup races with his own hands on the steering wheel, also built the cars that won 140 more races with other men's hands on the wheel. The same man who served time in federal prison for moonshine production also received a presidential pardon that recognized the rehabilitation and the legitimate success he had achieved in the decades following his conviction. The range of the life, the span of the experience, the breadth of the contribution, these are without parallel in the history of the sport. The mechanical genius that Johnson demonstrated throughout his career was one of the least celebrated but most significant dimensions of his contribution. Johnson was not merely a driver who happened to own a team. He was an engineer whose understanding of the machine, of its capabilities and its limitations, of the relationship between the engine and the chassis and the aerodynamics and the driver, was as deep and as comprehensive as any engineer in the sport. He built engines, he designed chassis modifications, he developed aerodynamic innovations. He understood the car at a level that allowed him to prepare machines that were consistently among the fastest in the field, and the understanding was rooted not in formal education, but in the practical knowledge that a lifetime of working with machines had provided. The intuitive dimension of Johnson's mechanical intelligence was one of his most distinctive characteristics. He did not approach the engineering challenges of stock car racing with the analytical methodology of a trained engineer. He approached them with the feel of a man who had been building and modifying engines since his teenage years, who could sense what a machine needed by listening to it, by touching it, by observing its behavior with the kind of holistic, intuitive awareness that formal education cannot provide. The intuition was not a substitute for knowledge. It was a complement to it, a way of processing information that supplemented the analytical approach and that sometimes produced insights that the analytical approach alone could not generate. The talent identification that Johnson demonstrated during his ownership career was another dimension of his genius. The ability to look at a young driver and to see, beneath the raw speed and the rough edges, the champion that the driver could become, was a skill that required not just knowledge but judgment, the ability to assess character and potential with a depth that went beyond the surface-level indicators that most evaluators relied on. Johnson's decision to hire Cale Yarborough at a time when Yarborough was perceived by many as too wild and too undisciplined to be a championship contender was a testament to Johnson's ability to see what others could not, to recognize the champion that was hidden inside the wild man, and to create the environment in which the champion could emerge. Let that sink in. The same ability that allowed Johnson to feel the draft at Daytona before anyone could explain it, the ability to sense something that was present but not yet visible, was the ability that allowed him to identify talent in drivers who had not yet demonstrated their full capabilities. The intuition was the same, the application was different, but the underlying cognitive skill, the ability to perceive patterns and possibilities that were not yet apparent to others, was the thread that connected the drafting discovery to the talent identification, and that unified the diverse dimensions of Johnson's career into a coherent whole. The cultural significance of Junior Johnson's story extends beyond the racing community to the broader American narrative. The moonshiner who became a champion, the convict who received a presidential pardon, the outlaw who became a legend. The story resonates with some of the deepest themes of the American experience: the belief in second chances, the admiration for self-made men, the conviction that a person's origins do not determine their destiny, and the romance of the outlaw figure who operates outside the boundaries of conventional society, but who possesses qualities of courage, skill, and independence that the society secretly admires. Tom Wolfe understood this resonance better than anyone. The Esquire article that Wolfe published in 1965 captured not just the facts of Johnson's life, but the meaning of those facts, the way that Johnson's story connected to the larger American mythology of individualism, rebellion, and the self-made man. Wolfe's writing elevated Johnson from a sporting figure to a cultural figure, from a man who was known within the racing community to a man who was known to the broader American public, and the cultural elevation was permanent, shaping the way Johnson was understood and discussed for the rest of his life. The Wilkes County connection that anchored Johnson's life was more than a geographic detail. It was a defining characteristic, a declaration of identity, and of values that Johnson maintained through every stage of his career. He never left Wilkes County. Despite the fame and the wealth that his racing career provided, despite the opportunities that would have been available to him in the larger cities and the more cosmopolitan communities of the American landscape, Johnson remained in Ronda, on the land that his family had farmed for generations, connected to the community and the culture that had shaped him. The decision to stay was a statement about priorities, about the importance of roots and community, and the relationship between a man and the place that made him. The farming that Johnson maintained throughout his life was not a hobby or a retirement activity. It was a vocation, a continuation of the agricultural tradition that had been the economic foundation of the Johnson family for generations: the cattle, the crops, the land. These were the constants of Johnson's life, the elements that remained unchanged through the transformations that the racing career produced. The farming connected Johnson to the rhythms of the natural world and to the values of the rural culture that had shaped him, providing a counterweight to the intensity and the artificiality of the racing world. The deeper truth about Junior Johnson is that his life was a bridge between the outlaw origins of stock car racing and its legitimate present, a bridge between the dirt roads of Wilkes County and the paved superspeedways of the national circuit, a bridge between the intuitive, feel-based approach to racing that characterized the early era and the analytical, data-driven approach that characterizes the modern sport, a bridge between the past and the future of the sport, connecting the moonshine runners, who were the sport's first competitors, to the corporate champions who are its current stars. The bridge was built by one man, one life, one extraordinary career that encompassed both sides of every transition that the sport underwent during the 6 decades of Johnson's involvement. The completeness of the bridging, the fact that Johnson was present and significant on both sides of every divide, is the most remarkable aspect of a life that was, from beginning to end, one of the most remarkable in the history of American sport. What does Junior Johnson's legacy mean to the sport of NASCAR today? The question is best answered not with statistics or with arguments, but with a simple observation. The sport exists in its current form because Junior Johnson helped create it. The observation is not hyperbole. It is a factual statement that can be supported by the evidence of Johnson's contributions at every stage of the sport's development, from the moonshine culture that provided its origins to the drafting innovation that shaped its competitive character, to the team ownership career that demonstrated the organizational principles on which its modern structure is built. The drafting legacy is the most visible and the most consequential of Johnson's contributions to the sport's competitive identity. The pack racing that defines the superspeedway events at Daytona and Talladega, the slingshot passes and the tandem drafting and the last lap dicing that produce some of the most exciting finishes in the sport, all of these are descendants of the principle that Johnson discovered during a practice session in 1960. The principle has been refined, studied, and optimized through 6 decades of engineering analysis and competitive experience, but its origin is a single man's intuitive feel for the behavior of his car in the aerodynamic wake of the car ahead. The team ownership legacy is equally significant, though less immediately visible to the casual fan. Johnson's 6 championships as a team owner established a standard of excellence that subsequent team owners have aspired to match. The organizational principles that Johnson applied, the talent identification, the engineering innovation, the strategic management of championship campaigns, the willingness to push the boundaries of the rules in search of competitive advantage, these were principles that influenced every team owner who followed him and that continue to shape the competitive culture of the sport. The cultural legacy, the moonshiner to champion narrative that Wolff immortalized and that the sport has embraced as one of its foundational, is the dimension of Johnson's contribution that resonates most broadly. The story of Junior Johnson is one of the great American stories, a narrative of transformation, redemption, and the triumph of talent and determination over the limitations of circumstance. The story connects the sport to the broader American experience in ways that the more polished, more corporate narratives of the modern era cannot replicate, and its enduring appeal is a reminder that the sport's most powerful stories are the ones that touch the deepest chords of the national character. The Wilkes County legacy, the connection between the sport's origins and the community that produced one of its greatest figures, is maintained through the continued presence of the Johnson name and the Johnson story in the cultural life of the region. The moonshine heritage that was once a source of shame and legal jeopardy has been reinterpreted, in the decades since Johnson's career brought national attention to it, as a source of pride and cultural identity, a chapter in the region's history that is now celebrated rather than concealed. The transformation of the moonshine narrative from stigma to celebration is itself a legacy of Johnson's career, a demonstration that the past, however complicated, can be a source of strength rather than a source of shame. The NASCAR Hall of Fame recognition that Johnson received as a member of the inaugural class was the formal acknowledgement of a contribution that had been recognized informally for decades. The placement in the inaugural class, alongside Petty, Earnhardt, and the Francis, was a statement about the scope and the significance of Johnson's impact, an acknowledgement that his contribution to the sport was on the same level as those of its most celebrated figures. The loss of Junior Johnson in December of 2019 was the loss of the last living connection to the sport's most mythologized origins, the moonshine culture that provided the skills and the competitive spirit that stock car racing was built on. Johnson was the last of the great figures who had directly participated in the moonshine running that preceded and paralleled the early days of NASCAR, and his death severed a link between the sport's present and its past that cannot be reconstructed. The link was not merely historical, it was personal, embodied in the memory and the character of a man who had lived both chapters of the story, the outlaw chapter and the champion chapter, and who had carried the connection between them in his own person. The sport continues, the races are run, the championships are decided, and the legacy of Junior Johnson endures, woven into the fabric of the enterprise, in ways that are sometimes visible and sometimes hidden, but that are always present, always shaping the way the sport competes, and the way it understands itself. The legacy is in the draft that carries the cars at Daytona. It is in the championships that the team owners pursue. It is in the moonshine mythology that gives the sport its most romantic and most distinctly American origin story. And it is in the memory of a man who was, from the dirt roads of Wilkes County to the championship stages of the Cup Series, the most complete and the most extraordinary figure the sport has ever produced. In the end, the story of Junior Johnson is the story of a man who was bigger than the sport that made him famous. The sport gave him a stage. He gave the sport its character. The sport provided the competition. He provided the innovation that changed the way the competition was conducted. The sport produced the championships. He produced the champions. The relationship between Junior Johnson and the sport of NASCAR was not the relationship between an athlete and his arena. It was the relationship between a creator and his creation, between a man whose genius was expressed through every dimension of the enterprise, and a sport that bore the imprint of that genius in every aspect of its competitive identity. 50 victories as a driver, 6 championships as an owner, 140 victories from the pit box, the discovery of drafting, the presidential pardon, the Tom Wolfe essay, the moonshine roads of Wilkes County, the prison sentence that interrupted but did not end the career, the comeback that proved the resilience, the retirement that honored the achievement, the life that encompassed more transformation, more drama, and more significance than any other life in the sport's history. The man from Ronda, the moonshiner's son, the convict, the champion, the owner, the innovator, the legend. Junior Johnson was all of these things, and the fact that all of them coexisted in a single life, that one man could contain so many identities and could express all of them with a quality that placed him at the summit of each, is the central, defining marvel of his extraordinary story. But here is what makes this unforgettable. Junior Johnson never forgot where he came from. The fame did not change him. The championships did not change him. The presidential pardon did not change him. The money did not change him. He remained, from the beginning to the end, the farmer's son from Ronda, the man who measured his life not by the trophies on his shelf or the headlines in the newspapers, but by the quality of his work, the integrity of his conduct, and the depth of his connection to the land and the community that had made him who he was. The headlights are off, the road is dark, the engine rumbles in the night, and somewhere in the hollows of Wilkes County, the ghost of a teenage boy in a modified Ford coupe is still running, still driving, still racing the darkness with the absolute conviction that the speed in his hands and the courage in his heart are enough to carry him wherever he needs to go. They called him Junior, and the name, simple and familiar and utterly without pretension, was the perfect name for a man whose greatness was rooted not in the extraordinary but in the ordinary, not in the spectacular but in the fundamental, not in the distance he travelled from where he began, but in the connection he maintained to the place and the people and the values that had started him on his way. The engines are quiet now. The roads of Wilkes County are paved and lit and patrolled by officers who have no moonshine runners to chase. The world that produced Junior Johnson is gone, replaced by a world that is faster and safer and more connected and less wild. But the legacy remains. The draft at Daytona remains. The championships remain. The story remains. And the name, Junior Johnson, spoken with the same reverence that the racing world reserves for its most sacred figures, endures as the most improbable and the most American name in the history of the sport.